We are so excited today to be joined by Beau Borders and David Wyman, two members of the Oscar-nominated sound team for Greyhound on Apple TV+. Beau Borders is both a sound engineer and a race car driver who worked as the re-recording mixer on Greyhound. His film career began in the 90s at George Lucas's famed Skywalker Ranch. Since then, he has worked on many films, including Titanic, Armageddon, Pearl Harbor, and The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King. Additionally, he was nominated for an Oscar for Best Sound Mixing in 2014 for Lone Survivor.
And David Wyman worked as the sound mixer on Greyhound. He began his interest in sound at the young age of 14 when he first visited a recording studio in London. Prior to becoming a sound mixer, he worked as a boom operator on commercials, documentaries, and short films. His first role as a sound mixer came in 2002 with The Haunted Mansion. Since then, David has worked on films like 22 Jump Street, The Big Short, which he also was featured in as an actor, The Hate U Give, and Underwater. Additionally, he earned a BAFTA nomination for Best Sound in 2017 for his work on Deepwater Horizon.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We're so excited to talk to you about Greyhound and this award season. So congratulations on all of your nominations at the Oscars, BAFTAs, Cinema Audio Society. How did you react when you heard that you received a nomination for Best Sound?
I would say that I was probably more shocked than I am right now to find out that David Wyman was an actor in The Big Short. I had no idea.
I knew that would come up.
The internet.
Yeah.
Does it haunt you to this day?
No, but there are several crew members that will come up to me and repeat back the one line that I had that I gave to Brad Pitt, and it just becomes a standing joke.
I love that.
So, all right. So we get back to the question.
Oh yeah, I forgot there was a question.
You're fine.
This was just an absolutely wonderful surprise. It's kind of a cool way that you guys are interviewing David and I, because he's the first person on the set as far as sound goes, as he's on set recording the actors. And I'm essentially the last person as the re-recording mixer, where I take all the final ingredients and make that thing that you hear in the theaters. So it's kind of fun. Like, our stories couldn't be more different. We don't cross paths in our workflow. David is there as they're filming. I didn't start the film until almost a year after they stopped filming. So it was quite a long process, and it's been really fun to get to know David and get to hear all the crazy tricks and things that he did to get Greyhound recorded, authentically. And it's been a fun ride. It's been an amazing, wonderful thing that BAFTA recognized us, and then the Academy followed suit. It's been great.
I was very humbled to hear that we'd been Oscar nominated. That was, that is absolutely the pinnacle of the awards season, and consequently, it's a great honor. No less an honor to be nominated by our peers at the Cinema Audio Society and also BAFTAs. I'm just thankful that Beau was the last person to touch the movie and managed to tie up all the. Beau got us that Oscar nomination. No, I mean,
it's a good team. It's a team.
No, it is. I'm being appropriately sarcastic. No, the nomination and the immense amount of hard work that we put into this movie, it's really been a blessing to be nominated, to be able to tell a story, because so often, many movies get made and people work exceptionally hard on them, and they're very difficult to do, and they come out with an amazing product, but yet if they're not in the final run, then the movie may stand the test of time, but the actual explanation of how it was done really never gets told.
And I think that was what was fun for me, was reading the press notes, looking at other interviews, and hearing about what you've done with the film and in using old equipment, say. And we will get to that in a few questions. But first off, we also briefly mentioned how you got into sound and working in cinema, but what inspired you specifically to these roles and then with this Greyhound project? Beau, you can go first.
Sure. Well, I started my career on the sound editing side. So kind of the gathering and creation of sound effects. And I was drawn to that as an intern. I was very, very lucky, where Gloria Borders, who was a supervising sound editor, one of the only women to win an Academy Award for sound, for her work on Terminator 2. And when I was 18, I got this internship at Skywalker. I had never been to California. I'd never been on a movie set. I was not around films at all. I grew up in a race car garage in New Jersey, working on my dad's race cars. And but I was a musician, and I was into technology, and so I it was a good fit. And I was really only supposed to do a 2-month long summer internship, and I didn't really have a concept of where I was or what I was doing. And they gave me they very apologetically gave me what they called grunt work, which was to take these giant 3-ring binders of notes and make a database out of them. And I started with Terminator 2, the movie, and I started typing in basically all these sound ingredients for what all the sounds were made up of. And I started to get the concept that what you hear isn't always the actual thing, that it's not literal. And it's easy to think of that when you think of in terms of like dinosaurs and things that we don't have sound recordings of. But even the most simple things, were created out of something else. So a light bulb started to go off, and then I got to the part where I'm hoping that many of your viewers have seen Terminator 2 when I tell the story. The bad guy Terminator in it's called the T-1000, and he's made out of liquid metal, and he changes shapes and he morphs in the movie. And I'm typing away, and I got to the part of the sound of the T-1000, and it was the sound of Alpo dog food sliding out of a can mixed with aerosol cheese whiz. And my brain exploded when I read that and went, oh, this is just the coolest job on the planet. I have to do this. So my 2-month internship was supposed to come to a close, and I got some great advice from some great mentors, and I stayed for 10 years, and worked my way through the sound editorial ranks. And then eventually I just naturally started this workflow of not just thinking about the sound effects, just really thinking more about the final product and how sounds move around the room and how sounds balance off of each other. And that's kind of what a sound re-recording mixer does. We take all of the ingredients, and if you play all of them at once, you end up with mud. But if you really start carving through and looking for the story, you can figure out which little piece of sound tells the story. And I just gravitated towards that, and I've been a re-recording mixer ever since.
Like a lot of people in the sound film industry, we come from musical backgrounds because that's the most accessible, idea of sound that a young kid can get. I started messing around with a reel-to-reel recorder probably when I was 11 or 12. My neighbor, who I was playing in an awful band with, we go around to his house and rehearse, and he had a reel-to-reel, and I just started messing around with it, and then like you said in my bio, by the time I was about 14, I was actually quite competent as a bass player, and I was also an orchestral musician. So I had this sort of interesting dichotomy of being a rock musician at the same time being orchestrally trained. So my ears were very trained to listen to multiple sound sources at once, which you have to do in an orchestra. And then I found myself in a recording studio, and I was absolutely fascinated. I looked at that mixing board, and see you, Bob. I looked at that mixing board, and I was in awe. I was like, look at all these knobs and dials, and all of this stuff, and all these lights, and this massive, 2-inch 24-track reel-to-reel. And so, I just offered my services, and I worked for free, and I continued to record, with bands. I played did a little session work, and that kind of continued into my late teens, and then I got a job interning for a film company in Wardour Street in England. The employment situation in England was very poor at that time, and you just basically did whatever you could. And the internship sort of PA role came up, so I went up and I had my interview, and they said, we'll take you on for 6 months, and which they did. And I spent a lot of time with the editor who used to edit in the very old school way on the old moviolas, and just winding the film. And he would always charge me with rewinding the stock, and then he allowed me to start splicing some of the audio together, and so on 35mm magnetic tape. So I started to learn a little bit more about the process, and at the same time, I would go. I think it was about 3 times a week to a class at the North London University Polytechnic to understand sound acoustics and dynamics, because ultimately I knew I wanted to become a studio recording engineer. Well, that was the ultimate goal until one day the director came up to me and he said, there was only 3 people in the office: the director, the producer, and the office manager. And the director came up to me and says, "You know about sound, right?" I said, "Well, yeah, I do know a little bit." He says, "Good, learn how this works." And he gave me a Niagara machine, a boom pole, and a timecode slate. He said, "You're coming to Norway tomorrow. Our sound mixer has just gone under with appendicitis, and we need somebody right now." So off I went to Norway, and we did a documentary on the British Army training for Siberian conditions, which is a myriad of stories all in itself. But that was really my first foray, and then I left the company, but I continued to go back to them and work. I think I did 3 or 4 small little projects after that as just an independent contractor. I moved to Los Angeles several years later after having had a 12-year career in finance, and then went back and got totally burned out and went back to my passion, which was sound. And the rest, it's just a move slowly up through the chain and getting my chops and understanding, what needs to be done. I think that the time I spent in the corporate world, with a suit and tie on, with dealing with all these millions and millions of dollars, really helped to educate me in how best to deal when you're talking to people who are above the line, when you're dealing with producers, when you have to, tell truth to power, if you will. I think that really helped me not to be, not to be nervous or afraid, and ultimately it just helps you concentrate on your job, which is what you're there to do. I'm sorry, my dogs are going crazy.
It's okay.
Okay.
We'll clean them out in post-production.
Thank you. Yeah. As far as Greyhound's concerned, Greyhound was shot in Baton Rouge, and I positioned myself in New Orleans in about 2011, 2012. Because in Los Angeles, there's such a huge stable of phenomenal mixers in Los Angeles, but there wasn't much work for movies. A lot of stuff had gone to Canada, and a lot of stuff was going, to the other states that had, great tax incentives for production. So I decided to move so that I could maybe be a slightly bigger fish in a smaller pond. And so, having worked on the movies, some of the movies you named, I was just fortunate enough to get a call to work on Greyhound, and and I heard it was a Tom Hanks script, and Tom Hanks was in it, and you don't say no to that. So I wasn't really fully prepared to. I didn't really understand what I was getting myself into, but it shortly became clear.
Yeah, thank you so much. I feel like now I want to know so much information about like Terminator 2 and the documentary you worked on. So going to Greyhound again, I think our listeners have probably heard of how sound works in movies, and you've both already touched on this. And I think you've done a really great job kind of describing how your roles differ. But if you could talk about how you collaborate as a team, because Best Sound is a team award. So if you could just talk about how you collaborated on this film specifically.
I'm going to start, as I'm the first one that presses record. Well, I think it makes sense. As far as the collaboration is concerned, it's an interesting dynamic, because invariably I will not talk to the post-production people while we're in production unless there is a specific request that may come from editorial for some wild lines, or maybe some background effects they would like. Like, for instance, I've had requests to go out and record the streetcars of New Orleans because they're featured in a piece, and they wanted something clean and they wanted it to be genuine. I've set microphones up overnight in a wooded area because we were shooting there, and they wanted the night sounds to accompany, some of the night work we've done, and so on and so forth. But it's a very limited liaison that we have between the two departments. But what is interesting is, at all times that I'm recording and I'm setting up what tracks I'm going to record, how I'm going to record them, and how the metadata is going to be laid out, and just how the tracks are going to be laid out. I'm thinking, is somebody in post going to be able to understand what it is that I'm doing? Because ultimately, that's the ultimate goal. I mean, you've got to get the tracks cleanly recorded. You have to get the content, but the content is no good if it's so mismanaged in the recording process, or it's not delineated enough so that the post guys can go in there and actually do something with it, or want to do something with it. Because there's many occasions where if it's not clear, they'll be like, forget that, I'm just going to go to the library and get my own shit. That's the way I feel I collaborate with post, whether it's a conversation on person to person, or whether it's the conversation of, here comes some product that I've recorded. I hope that it meets the requirements, and I hope you understand the way that I did it.
Then once they're done shooting and the editing process begins and the visual effects process begins, that's when our sound editorial team comes on. And we had Dave McMoyler, who's specializes just in taking Mr. David Wyman's tracks and laying them out in an organized way, so that they'll flow from scene to scene. There'll be multiple takes. We do a lot of things where if they've shot 5 different versions of a scene, maybe the audio is from the second version, but the visuals from the 5th version. So, there's a lot of mixing and matching that goes on. So it's a big, just laying out the production dialogue is a huge puzzle piece. And in Greyhound, it was much more complicated because David had this great idea of recording all of the communications using, period correct equipment, which he'll get into in a little bit. So that's just the dialogue team. Then there's re-recorded dialogue because maybe there were new ideas later, or the script changed later, or in editorial, they're going to decide to lose a scene and go off script a little bit. So you need a different line of dialogue to just make that make sense. So, that's another layer of audio. Then now that ADR has to sound like it was recorded on that ship in Baton Rouge. And then there's the sound effects team, which, in Greyhound, and actually in all movies, every sound effect is separately edited later. David needs to isolate the dialogue of our actors and try not to hear the things like the birds and the buzzing of the lights and the whirring of the generators on sets and the fans. He's trying to figure out how to isolate that actor's dialogue. Well, then the sound effects team looks at it completely opposite and says, without the dialogue, what should we be hearing? Well, in the case of Greyhound, we're going to hear all the surf and the wind and the water crashing against the bow. And we're going to hear these sonar pings, and there's a torpedo in the water. What does the whirring of the torpedo sound like? What do these guns sound like that haven't been fired since World War II? So they're going to come up with all these layers, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of layers of sound effects. And then there's the music. The music has been recorded with complete separation. Every instrument is recorded and mixed separately. And that way, just like the sound effects, we have ultimate control. We can decide later, what do we want to hear? Do we want to hear drums? Do we want to hear violins? Do we only want to hear music and no sound effects? Do we need to focus on that line of dialogue? So it ends up being pretty much the most complicated jigsaw puzzle you can think of. But if we've all come together as a team, then you just go on this ride. You're just convinced that you're on a battleship in World War II and the submarines are out to get you. Or in the case of, our other co-nominated movies, you think you're in the Old West on a wagon, or you think you're a jazz musician in New York. You shouldn't really ever really think about what you're hearing. You should just go on the emotional ride. And that's what's been fun about being among these other nominees this year, is all the movies are so different, so different in tone and shape and content. Yet when you really break it down, on every movie, we all do the same thing. It's just every movie, it's a different crew, it's a different workflow, and the movie asks something different of you. But what we did in Greyhound, as far as how to collaborate with our sound team, isn't really going to be that much different than the other nominees that you'll speak to in sound. It's always very complicated.
Yeah, I think there's so much fluidity. It's not something you initially isolate because it sounds so real. Reading that this might have been done on a ship, but not on the water, was mind-blowing, because that sound just seems so real, looks so real, even though it's CG and created in a studio, basically. Or on the water separately. So that's really cool. And I mean, again, congratulations. That's a great feat. So speaking of the equipment now, you had used equipment from the 40s. So the film takes place during the Battle of the Atlantic in 1942. Mm-hmm. So because everything had to be period correct, how did you go about modifying the equipment that initially didn't work to make sure that the sound was authentic? And did you feel that this authenticity from this equipment gave you a better sound than something you could digitally remaster or mix later on?
I think it's important to understand why we undertook this journey. So everything had to be period correct because that was the director's vision. He didn't want anything that wasn't period correct in the movie. But also part of the director's, of Aaron's sort of edict was he wanted all of our actors to behave as if they were in battle on the ocean. And, to that end, we had this giant gimbaled set that I've said this before in other interviews, but when you see the picture go from level to like this, it's not the camera that's moving that way, it's the set that's moving. So we had this incredible gimbal that actually could mimic. It was all computerized, and they could mimic different sea states that they'd programmed into it. I mean, so much to the point that people did get seasick on the gimbal. Crew members got seasick. Some of the actors felt very queasy. And as over time, people got used to it. But the first couple of days was kind of interesting. So we had this sort of edict. So they have to be in battle. They have to feel like they're in battle. And they have to do everything that they would have done if they were in battle. So I went to the USS Kidd to understand what does that actually mean. And the actors went to the USS Kidd, which is the floating museum in Baton Rouge. It's an identical Fletcher-class destroyer to the one that's in the story, the USS Keeling. And they spent a week there with Captain Dale Dye, who is world-renowned as Marine coordinator and military advisor for movies. He drummed into them everything that they had to do, how they would answer, how they would behave, where they're supposed to go, what their stations were when a certain order was called, whether they were permitted to walk into the pilot house or not, whether they were dismissed or not, and this whole, and then how do they communicate with the rest of the ship, and that then landed on me to make that communication portal a reality. And in the USS Kidd, everything was, like I've said, it was like a telephone exchange. You press a button or you pick up a phone, it's directly wired to the person that you want to talk to at the other end. And obviously none of the equipment we had worked in that manner or was even intended to work in that manner. It was just supposed to be set dressing so that it looked period correct. But the director wanted every actor to be on set at all times, whether they were being shot that day or not, because if there was a dialogue line that they were due to give, it had to be sent back live through this old equipment back to the actor that was on set. And that was absolutely, there was no negotiation on that. So I had to modify all of this gear to make sure that it did actually work. And a lot of the modifications I undertook were basically replacing a lot of the headphone drivers and making sure that the wiring worked. And then I had to set up all of these unique, discrete wireless and hardwire channels that came to a completely separate mixer so that we could actually mix that audio in time with the script, because there's no point in having an open speaker when I'm trying to record a line of dialogue that isn't featured until 3 lines later, because all you're going to get is noise on the set. So we had to be very judicious about how we organize this. And then some of the last modifications I did is I put microphones in the guys that wear the helmets, the talkers, that run in and out of the ship, put microphones in their equipment so I could actually record it. And then I used those microphones to send that audio to the other mixer so that he could then broadcast it to the sonar guy or whoever needed to hear it, so that their place in the script and their timing of their duty was kept up. And then we had also a bunch of off-screen push-to-talk microphones for the actors who were off-screen. They came through speakers, they came through phones, they came through the earpieces. So it was a huge deal to figure out how to make that system work. And that was the bulk of the modifications that I did. And then, of course, if you've got all those audio signals and you've hidden the microphones like I did in plain sight, I had them all painted by the paint shop so I could dot these microphones close to the equipment so that I could pick up the audio and send it somewhere else. If you've done all of that work, well, why not record it? So that's what we did. Well, I made sure that I had a feedback from the mixer that was doing all of the sends and returns, and so I looped that into my recording station and added that to all of the other production dialogue that I was tasked to record.
Wow, that is so interesting to learn about, because when you're watching a film like this, I think I notice the sound. I think it sounds great, but don't think about all of those little details of how it all came together and how it's period correct. I want to know too, just about the water sounds, how you weren't filming out on open water. So how did you capture those sounds, and were they difficult to mix?
A lot of those came from existing recordings. I've heard stories about my co-mixer, Mike Minkler, hanging off the side of a boat trying to record appropriate water, and that falls into the category of a sound that it doesn't have to be period correct. Water is water. It's the sound quality has never changed. So it's just about looking at the movie and deciding what kind of water do you need. And we take our emotional cues from the story. So if you think about it, you can cut to a shot of the ship and you can just hear the water kind of chopping along. And maybe in the story, the ship is just moving forward. There's nothing crazy happening just yet. But then all of a sudden there's a submarine chasing us and we're trying to figure out where they are. We're trying to position the ship exactly in a spot where the torpedo won't take us out. Well, then when you cut to the side of the ship and you hear the water, now it's crashing and booming and it's in the subwoofer and it's aggressive. Well, if you think about it, the water's not doing anything any different than it just was in the other shot. But emotionally in the story, we've ratcheted up the tension. We've tried to kick in the adrenaline a little bit. So in that specific case, we did it with water. We used a little subliminal trick that you're not really going to notice. But if you really think in reality, water crashing against the ship is going to sound the same no matter what your perspective. But if you use it as a little fun storytelling tool, then you can just add to the tension.
I love that. And I definitely felt that tension throughout this film, and the sound was a huge part of that. So I think we're both curious too, what did you learn from this particular project that you hope to use in future projects?
The things that I learned most of all about recording the production audio was that a lot of planning is your friend. And sometimes you don't get that opportunity. Sometimes, you just, your scene is just kind of thrust on the day and away you go. And, and then you rely on your crew to really help you navigate that as it happens. But having all of that pre-planning and having all of that prep really helped me to have a much easier time during the filming of it than I think I would have done without it. And then that's one of those things that I really have to thank the producers, for allowing me that time, because it's all part of the budget. I'm supposed to be on the payroll from 2 days prior to production, and they push that forward 3 weeks. Well, that's a considerable investment that they've made, but hopefully it paid off. So, and I think that also, with a lot of these very complicated movies, I think there's a beginning to be an understanding that there are certain departments who maybe, such as the sound department, who maybe were not given an early entry into the project for budgetary reasons, but they're realizing that in the end it saves it saves them money in the end, and also creates a more fluid project, during the production to actually bring, departments like mine on earlier on.
I think a thing that I learned, or maybe it's just more of a perspective shift, is, this Greyhound was nominated in the first year that the 2 separate sound awards were combined into one. It used to be sound editing and sound mixing. It's been different variations of that in the past. And it's been a really great unification of the crew because we are 2 members of a large crew. You know, I have a co-mixer, Mike Minkler, who's been mixing as long as I've been alive. You know, his son, Chris Minkler, worked on the movie as well with Richard Kidding, who was our mix tech. We have sound designers, Ann Shabeli and John Title. We have Will Digby, and, you know, Warren Shaw was their supervising sound editor. I mean, like the list goes on and on. It's such a huge crew. And there used to just be a line divided right between us. And when it came time for recognition, the sound editors were over here and the sound mixers were over there. And because of the way we all work creatively and technically now, the lines have been blurred. So it's really nice that we can actually just celebrate all this together. And rather than say, I did this and you did this, now we use the word we a lot more, I notice. And that's been a really great perspective shift. And that's new this year. And I think, you know, what the Academy has done to kind of unify us has made people like you a lot more aware of what we do. There's a lot less confusion in what we do now. And that's been really great.
So just to wrap up here, we like to ask every guest something on the pod, and it's to see what you're wild for right now. So it could be a book, it could be a movie, TV show, anything you could think of.
I'm wild to get back to a movie theater and have a giant bucket of popcorn in a crowded room. And I want, when a joke happens, I want to hear everybody laugh, and I want to laugh along with them. And when the boogeyman comes out, I want to be shocked, and I want to see popcorn flying in the air when everybody's scared. And I'm wild about that. I want to get back to just, you know, streaming has been wonderful, and thank goodness for the technology of streaming and for the low cost of giant televisions and everything, but it just doesn't replace going to the movies. And I really am wild to have that back.
It's a great answer. We completely agree.
Yeah, I was rewatching Greyhound, trying to emulate that feeling of a theater, and
I got to see it. I got to see it and hear it in a big theater, and it just makes such a huge difference.
You know, I don't normally get wild about anything.
So British.
But I think it's along the similar lines to what Beau said. I'm actually wild to have a conversation face to face with somebody and see their lips move. I am so sick of the lack of fidelity of listening to people talk through masks. It just drives me crazy. It you know, because the most important thing about talking to somebody is that you can hear what they're saying. I mean, it's like, come on. So that for me, you know, because I spend my life listening to sound critically, you know, wherever I am, you know, which also drives my wife crazy, because I'll be like, you hear that? That thing's knocking. I got to stop that thing knocking. She'd be like, it's 11 o'clock at night. I don't care. I got to stop it from knocking right now. You know, and I can hear a leaf blower from 5 blocks away, man. But I really miss that, the fidelity of talking to people face to face without the mask on. And I'm wild to get that back.
We all are. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, very ready to return to theaters, to return to real conversations with people face to face. So thank you both so much for joining us today, even though it was virtual. We're so excited for you, both for your nominations and for Greyhound, which is a great film with incredible sound work in it. So thank you again for talking to us today.
Thank you for having us. Yeah, thanks for having us, and congratulations to all the nominees. It's a really fun year. Everybody just did such great work, and we're really proud to be part of it.
Thank you again. Good luck later today at the BAFTAs.
Yeah.
It's exciting.
Indeed.
We'll have to see later today and then tomorrow.
Something.
All right. Thank you, guys.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.